The euthanasia vans are coming. The euthanasia vans are coming. The euthanasia vans are coming. A book was written in 1974 as a response to Roe versus Wade. And it was called The Pre-Persons. Because we don't know what people are anymore. We don't know what persons are anymore. So you got the pre-persons and the persons. Who can we kill? Because we've decoupled being human from being a person. It was a tiny little book by a very famous author whose books have been turned into major Hollywood hits and films that warned America of what would happen if we couldn't define what a human was, what a baby was. With legalized abortion in America, this little book has seemingly predicted everything happening with the destruction of the dignity and sanctity of human life in the West. Buckle up, we're going to get into it. This is the Seth Gruber Show. Welcome to the show today, guys. This is one of the most interesting little stories and novels that was written in the 20th century that was incredibly prophetic. Have you noticed that there were always those who could see where bad ideas would take a culture and a society and a country and tried to warn their people, tried to warn their society and civilization? And like the prophets in the Old Testament, the people never listened to them. G.K. Chesterton was one of these individuals. Well, one of the less known peoples, although you know his works because of how many of them have been made into movies by Hollywood in America, is an author named Philip Dick. He wrote Blade Runner, Minority Report, and Total Recall. You've probably seen all of those movies, or some of those movies. Some of them are being remade again. Philip Dick wrote this really interesting little book in 1974 as a response to Roe versus Wade. And he was lambasted at the time by the big liberals who supported Roe versus Wade. And his book was called The Pre-Persons. The Pre-Persons. Pre-person. Not yet a person. And he, in this incredibly prescient little book, he proves the difficulty in defining personhood if it's not tied up in the recognition of human beings. In other words, if being human is no longer enough to be recognized as a quote-unquote person with rights, then you kind of open up the door to human abuses this side of the womb as well. In other words, if persons are no longer just the same as humans, then we'll inevitably give power over to the state to define who's a person and who isn't, to define the litmus test for personhood, who's in and who's out of the human family or from human rights. The Pre-Persons, I want to talk to you about this book because he seemingly has predicted the course of the sexual revolution that would like a, you know, like a truck run over American culture, family, children's rights for the next several decades, culminating in what he predicts in his book as essentially, this is a little dark, euthanasia vans. What do I mean by that? Buckle up for this episode. This is incredibly prophetic. In his dystopian America, Philip Dick portrays that the age that a child could be legally aborted had been pushed way out. Killing newborns was no longer infanticide. They were just expelled fetuses. One character says in his book, where was the line to be drawn finally? When the baby smiled its first smile? When it spoke its first word? Or reached for its first time for a toy it enjoyed? In the book, lawmakers keep moving the line from one arbitrary point to another until they finally settle, listen to this, on 12-year-olds when you can do algebra. Yep, that's when someone has the cognitive capacity to qualify as a person in his little novel, The Pre-Persons. So until the age of 12, you were a pre-person who could be killed for any reason. If the parents didn't want their pre-person, they could call the abortion center, who would send a van to collect the child and take him or her to be euthanized. They called it a postpartum abortion. Goodness gracious. He wrote this in 1974, guys. They called it a postpartum abortion. The vans even came equipped with happy music and nursery songs. So what happens when the Supreme Court decouples being human from being a person? If being human is no longer enough to have personhood rights, then what will ground those rights? What's the criteria for personhood? What do you have to achieve or exemplify or possess to be a person if being human is no longer enough? Ultimately, the logic behind abortion and Roe versus Wade will put all of us at risk. That's the premise of Philip Dick's book, The Pre-Persons, the difficulty in defining personhood when it's decoupled from being human. Because we use those terms synonymously, don't we? Interchangeably. Human, person, human. like we mean the same thing when we say that. Do you know what I'm saying? But the left for decades now has believed that just because you're a human doesn't mean you're a person. Well, fast forward to 2015, and British columnist Katie Hopkins literally called for euthanasia vans. She wrote in a piece, she said, or in an interview, she said, we just have far too many old people. She said, it's ridiculous to be living in a country where we can put dogs to sleep, but not people. Hey, she says, euthanasia vans, just like ice cream vans, could come to your home. It would all be perfectly charming, she says. They might even have a nice little tune they'd play. I mean this genuinely. I'm super keen on euthanasia vans. This is what she said. Now, one wonders if Katie Hopkins had read The Pre-Persons, or is she simply a product of her time and culture? Euthanasia vans are no longer just a joke or a laughing matter. The warnings in Philip Dick's prophetic book are now reality. I'm not kidding. Since at least 2012, a Dutch right to die organization has offered a mobile euthanasia, quote unquote, service. Their team travels around delivering lethal injections to people who weren't able to convince their doctor to kill them. These euthanasia vans have been nicknamed mobile death squads. Now, was Philip Dick just a conspiracy theorist and crazed lunatic? Or was he prophetic? His argument was that Roe versus Wade was just the beginning of legalizing human rights abuses outside of the uterus as well. His point was that when personhood is detached from biology, it becomes arbitrary and human rights and human value are now a creation of the state and those with political power. Has that happened? Well, let's look at this. We're going to answer that question in just 1 second. But first, we want to thank our friends and sponsor of the Seth Gruber Show at Every Life Diaper Company. Every Life Diaper Company. We love them. Okay. Me and my wife get our diapers from Every Life Diaper. And we saw we're spending basically the same. So I'm not even asking you to spend more money. I'm just asking you to buy diapers you're already buying, but get them from Every Life, the only pro-life diaper company in America and the fastest growing diaper company in America, because they don't support abortion. I know it's insane, but every major diaper company in America, all 8 of them, rhetorically or financially support killing babies in the womb, which is really weird, because if I ran a diaper company and I supported abortion, I would want to ban abortion. Because oh my gosh, I would sell so many diapers. I would get so rich. But they don't care about this because leftism is a mind virus and wokeism rots the brain. And so we're going to rebuild a culture of life by defunding and bankrupting a culture of death. When those who are the largest percentage of people having babies stop buying our diapers from pro-abortion people. Go to everylife.com, promo code Seth10, Seth10, to let them know we sent you and to get 10% off your first order. Seriously. Send the website to your pregnancy center and the nursery, the person who runs the nursery at your church. Okay, everylife.com, promo code Seth10. Join the only pro-life diaper company in America. So, guys, was Philip Dick just a conspiracy theorist, or was he prophetic? Was his 1974 book, The Pre-Persons, an indication and a pointer and a prophecy of where we're at today and where we're going, or was he just a crazed idiot? Well, let's look at it. Who has seemingly attempted to make it their life goal to prove Philip Dick's warnings true? His name would be Peter Singer. Peter Singer, we've talked about on the show a lot. Peter Singer has literally earned himself a chapter in a book called Architects of the Culture of Death. Peter Singer is an advocate of bestiality, okay, which they call zoophilia. Okay, that's the sexual arousal of animals and sex with animals. Because he says, well, those animals can be persons too, because they have sentience and maybe self-awareness. And so what's wrong with sex with animals? Okay, yes, like full-blown Old Testament insanity. But Peter Singer is also probably the foremost philosophical defender of abortion rights and infanticide, because he's honest enough to say that the same qualities that he defines personhood to be, he says those qualities which the unborn does not possess are also not possessed by the newborn child, which is a point pro-lifers make. Right? Pro-lifers like myself say, whatever personhood qualities you say make one a person, and so you say the baby doesn't have those qualities, well, guess what? The newborn doesn't yet either. That 6-inch journey through the birth canal didn't suddenly give the baby those qualities. So pro-lifers say, hey, why not just kill the newborn too? And Peter Singer goes, hold my beer. Peter Singer defends killing babies up to 1 year old. And he said that 2-year-old babies, 2 years old, are a gray area. A gray area for what? For whether they're persons or not. That's what Peter Singer believes. And he has pushed the line of who is a person further out than nearly anyone else. In other words, he would have been a great character in the Pre-Persons book by Philip Dick. And he emerges almost like a lawmaker straight out of the Pre-Persons book. Peter Singer has said, quote, the concept of a person is distinct from that of a member of the species Homo sapiens, and that it is personhood, not species membership, that is most significant in determining when it is wrong to end a life. So he's saying it's not the fact that you're human. It's the fact that you're a person that determines whether it's wrong to kill you or not. And he says that personhood are cognitive abilities. Well, that's the same thing that these dystopic characters in the Pre-Persons novel believe. They say until you can do algebra and you've advanced to that mental stage of a 12-year-old, you can be aborted, and it's just a postpartum abortion, right? Because you're just an expelled fetus, not a person. Peter Singer has even said, quote, "The liberal search for a morally crucial dividing line between the newborn baby and the fetus has failed to yield any event or stage of development that can bear the weight of separating those with a right to life from those who lack such a right." In other words, he's saying us libs are trying to find a clear dividing line that helps us justify the killing of the unborn but not the newborn. And I can't find that clear dividing line to separate killing those without a right to life and preserving those with a right to life. So maybe we should kill 1-year-olds too. That's what he's saying. Bioethicist Tom Beauchamp, another sort of philosopher, says, quote, "Because many humans lack properties of personhood or are less than full persons, they might be aggressively used as human research subjects or sources of organs. In other words, there are some humans who aren't persons. And so particularly for the baby in the womb, we should use them to experiment on them and steal their organs for those of us who are persons." Well, how do you define personhood? Yeah, I know. It gets really murky. It gets a little dicey, which was the whole point of Philip's book, The Pre-Persons. And these crackpot yet dangerous ideas didn't just start in the late 20th and early 20th century. Killing infants as an acceptable and legal practice is not a new invention of 20th century Darwinian progressives. Such practices were the norm, going back to the Canaanites, the Carthaginians, and throughout the first century Rome. It was Christianity, with its revolutionary teaching that every human being bore the image of God and was created equal, and the testimony of brave Christians who stepped up to defend the least and the weak, that eventually brought about the end to infanticide and even legal protections for unborn and born 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds who could be abandoned to die or murdered without legal ramifications for those who killed those children. This is why the progressive revolution that really took root in the early 20th century should not be seen or even referred to as a progressive movement. It is indeed, in every way, a regressive revolution. However, it was the early 20th century radicals who put this regressive culture of death on steroids, and so set the stage for freaking euthanasia vans. Peter Singer was by no means the first major intellectual of the 20th century to encourage Americans to just revisit infanticide as a social good. In fact, Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Supreme Court Justice, a political progressive and eugenicist, who authored the Buck versus Bell decision, which allowed the state to forcibly sterilize Americans considered a threat to the gene pool, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote how he advocated for, quote, putting to death infants that didn't pass the examination. He even expressed contempt towards anyone who, quote, was not prepared to kill anyone below standard. That decision was celebrated by Margaret Sanger and most eugenicists in the 1920s, that resulted in over 70,000 Americans from California to New York forcibly sterilized by their state governments to clean the gene pool and create a stronger race. Clarence Darrow, the famous lawyer in the 1925 Scopes trial, formerly was called the State of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes, and commonly referred to as the Scopes monkey trial. This was a Supreme Court decision that revolved around whether evolution could be taught in schools. You might be familiar with the Scopes monkey trial. Well, Clarence Darrow was a Darwinist, naturally favored teaching evolution, and supported removing God and the teaching of intelligent design from schools. He was a believer in the survival of the fittest. But Darrow also favored infanticide, the killing of infants. He urged people to, quote, listen to this, chloroform unfit children. Show them the same mercy that is shown beasts and those that are no longer fit to live. All right, these were major influential lawyers and revolutionaries of the 20th century. Included in this group, of course, were Harry Laughlin, one of the major eugenicists, Margaret Sanger, Madison Grant, Leon Whitney, Lothrop Stoddard, Henry Osborne, Charles Davenport, Harry Crampton, the Fords, the Carnegies, okay, the Rockefellers. All of them supported cleaning the gene pool, and many of them supported legal infanticide. Margaret Sanger is famous for saying the most merciful thing that a large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it. Margaret Sanger talked about how she had a lot of compassion for a father who had thrown his infant out the door and into the freezing cold snow because the child kept screaming and couldn't be comforted. And so she wrote in her book, My Fight for Birth Control, how she had keen sympathy for the man who, unable to handle the screaming, threw the nuisance out the door and into the snow. So a lot of the infanticidal elements and pro-abortion elements of the Sangers and the Oliver Wendell Holmes were pretty blatantly clear before the sexual revolution truly even took spark. This is all the same revolution and breakdown of a Judeo-Christian worldview that said you only have to be human to be a person with rights, to have human dignity and value that the laws and the government is going to recognize and protect. Right? That ours is an inclusive worldview. If you're human, you're in. You don't have to do anything else or perform in any way or prove any capabilities or capacities. You're just human. So you're an image bearer of God with dignity and rights. Not so on the left. They believe in human plus categories. So human plus born, human plus Aryan, human plus white, human plus high IQ. Do you see what I mean? And those people are more valuable than those lower classes, they argued, that don't meet the same litmus test. So Philip Dick's book, The Pre-Persons, is this incredibly prophetic prediction of what will happen to the country, to the laws, and to the culture with Roe versus Wade, ripping the term human from person apart. So how then do we define this thing called personhood? Well, Peter Singer and other philosophers and revolutionaries like him have taken that premise that being human is not enough to be a person, and they've expanded the definition of personhood in a way that excludes some 1-year-olds. Now, maybe not in law, but that's where they're trying to push it. And you've noticed it with Democrats today. They continue to expand those that they think it should be legal to kill. You think about the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, which has criminal penalties for anyone who allows an infant to die who survives a botched abortion. Because there's, believe it or not, there's no federal law against allowing an infant to die who survived a botched abortion. Fast forward to 2012, shortly before that kook, Katie Hopkins, starts advocating for euthanasia bans in the Netherlands. And in 2012, a couple psychopathic philosophers, high off their own intellectual flatulence, published a piece in the Journal of Medical Ethics called After Birth Abortion, Why Should the Baby Live? Yeah, after birth abortions. Yeah. Philip Dick called that postpartum abortions. And the article was initially removed from the journal's website after the harsh reaction against it. But to these philosophers' credit, they were merely following the premises of progressivism to their most heinous and horrific conclusions. The primary argument of their article is that they argue that the killing of newborns should be permitted in any situation where abortion is permitted, because they argue there's no essential difference between the fetus and the newborn. A point I've been making for years, and a point that Peter Singer has been openly admitting for decades. They wrote in their article, they said, merely being human is not in itself a reason for ascribing someone a right to life. They're literally saying and fulfilling the warning of Philip Dick's 1974 warning book, The Pre-Persons, where he says and warns that you can't really define personhood very well if it's not tied up in your membership in the species Homo sapiens. And they openly admit that in this article. Merely being human is not itself a reason for giving someone a right to life. They say fetuses are newborns and not persons. They say, since non-persons have no moral right to life, there are no reasons for banning after-birth abortions. The regressive moral revolution. Let's go back to infanticide in the 1st century. There's no reason to ban the murder of infants. And here's the thing. Most Americans, including those who support legal abortion, are not on board with this. But that doesn't mean that their ideology prohibits supporting it. These philosophers are intellectually consistent enough to say, hey, pro-choicers, your own beliefs about the unborn child should lead you to support killing infants as well. They're openly honest about that, something I appreciate. The authors even use the phrase in the, again, what's this article called? After birth abortion, why should the baby live? And they even use the phrase not worth living to refer to infants they think it should be legal to kill. Well, guess what? The Nazis had a phrase for that. It was Lebensunwertensleben. It meant life unworthy of life. Life unworthy. So life not worthy of life. So it's life, say the Nazis, but not worthy of having life. That's literally the phrase they use in this article. Not worthy of life. Because they acknowledge the baby's human. But it's not worthy of a life being protected because they say merely being human is not in itself a reason for ascribing someone a right to life. So the baby is Lebensunwertensleben. They're literally using the same phrase that the Nazis did. And by the way, that phrase comes from a book by Alfred Hoke and Carl Binding that both Heinrich Himmler read and Adolf Hitler read. And so in 1977, we had an infamous Supreme Court case called Floyd versus Anders. And it was about a little boy who survived for 21 days after an abortion. But the federal judge said that because the mother had decided to abort him, the case said, quote, the fetus in this case was not a person whose life state law could protect. So despite the fact that this baby had been outside the womb for 21 days, it's still not a person because it's not a life worth living, even though it was an infant and already born. So, like, the legal ramifications of Roe versus Wade began to unravel and began to have consequences in American law as early as 1977. James Watson, who discovered the DNA double helix, he says we should wait 3 days after a baby is born before deciding whether it should be allowed to live. I mean, these are major figures advocating infanticide and fulfilling Philip Dick's prophetic warnings. His colleague, Francis Crick, a molecular biologist, agrees. He says, no newborn infant should be declared human until it has passed certain tests regarding its genetic endowment. And if it fails these tests, it forfeits the right to life. So remember, the crackpot theories in our universities today will be the cultural orthodoxy 20 years later. The crackpot insane theories of professors and university students today are a cultural crystal globe. They show you what your culture will probably look like in about 20 years. Universities are crystal globes for the culture. So when a society adopts a worldview, whether it recognizes the worldview it's adopted or not, it will probably start working out the consequences of that worldview. This is why it's very important to actually be a student of ideas, ideologies, philosophy, history, because this is a truism of human nature historically, is that even if a society might not support the consequences of its own worldview, it will work out the logic of that assumed worldview over time because we're rational beings. We've been made by God, so we're made to function that way. Nancy Pearcey puts this beautifully. She says, once a society accepts a worldview, it tends to work out the logical consequences. This process may proceed quickly or slowly, but because we are rational beings made in God's image, we tend to live out the implications of our convictions. So what is that worldview? What is that worldview that our cultural elites, philosophers, and politicians have accepted that move them so quickly from first trimester abortions to all trimester abortions to infanticide? Okay, I just gave you all the major figures advocating for infanticide, and to whatever comes next. Well, it's called personhood theory. It's called personhood theory or functionalism. And it says that your human dignity and the right to life are grounded in cognitive abilities and functions or accidental properties. But personhood theory assumes a certain radical Gnostic dualism, which treats the human body as distinct from the person. So you have this body right here, but it's not a person. It's just like a vessel or a car for you, the soul, to navigate like a puppeteer moves a puppet. So the person is metaphysical and only comes into existence when there are thoughts and desires and consciousness. So therefore, the unborn and newborn can be killed, they argue, because those metaphysical realities are not fully present in the unborn child yet. So as Nancy Pearcey explains, here's how a society begins to work out the logical consequences of the worldview that it's assumed. Watch where this goes. Very dangerous. She says the dualistic worldview was applied first to babies in the womb. She says the fetus was declared a non-person, disposable, expendable, and fair game for research and experimentation. But today, bioethicists have begun to apply the same dehumanizing logic to those already born. Because according to personhood theory, human dignity consists in the ability to exercise conscious, deliberate control over our lives. But if a disabled patient loses that mental control due to disease or injury, then personhood itself is lost, even though the patient is still alive and human. Whoa. Did you catch that? So in other words, the same dualistic worldview that undergirds and drives abortion also undergirds and drives euthanasia and doctor-assisted suicide. The euthanasia vans are coming. The euthanasia vans are coming. How prophetic. What did Philip Dick say in his little novel, The Pre-Persons? He's saying, well, Roe v. Wade says being human is no longer enough to be a person. So now how do we define personhood? Well, cognitive abilities and mental functions. And in the book, the lawmakers and legislators keep moving that litmus test and line and percentage of cognitive abilities and, prefrontal cortex and, brain waves and cortical brain activity all the way out to a 12-year-old who now, able to do algebra, has sufficient mental cognitive functioning to be granted a person and stops being a pre-person. But what's the worldview that animates this radical dualism? The dualism that says you can be human but not a person. Are you guys following me on the show today? I hope you are. I know this is a little heady, but what did those writers say in that after-birth abortion? Why should the baby live? They said merely being human is not in itself a reason for ascribing someone a right to life. What does Peter Singer say? He says that the concept of a person is distinct from that of a member of the species Homo sapien. So this radical dualism that rips apart human and person leads to what? Leads to euthanasia. Because that disabled patient in the hospital, they're not exercising a level of mental cognitive functioning that we now say is the new litmus test for personhood. But what do you mean? Why did you decide that's a person? Well, because we no longer based it on being human. And when you no longer base being a person on simply being a member of the species Homo sapiens, then the elite and those with political power and the philosophers, they begin to define and tinker with human dignity. They begin to design a litmus test for who's a person and who isn't. Because if it's not based on biology, I'm a human, then it has to be based on something else. And if it's based on anything other than our biology as humans, then it will be based on something we don't have in common, right? Do we all have the same level of IQ? No, right? Do we all have the same level of self-awareness? I don't know. Have you ever had to try to have a conversation with a 3-year-old? Doesn't go very well. What am I saying? I'm saying that those cognitive mental abilities are not shared equally. Some people have greater capacities for them. So if personhood is no longer based on biology, but it's based on these abilities, well, then does someone with a greater possession of those abilities have a greater right to life? In other words, what happens when you base personhood, define personhood on things that come in varying degrees? Well, then personhood comes in varying degrees. And those with a greater capacity for that personhood conferring capability can now wield power over those with less because they're more of a person. Do you see how this destroys human equality for everyone? That's what Nancy Pearcey's saying. The same dualistic worldview that undergirds and drives abortion also undergirds and drives euthanasia and doctor-assisted suicide. If the ability to exercise your conscious will, thoughts, and desires is what makes you a person, then when there is the absence of such cognitive abilities, then there is the absence of a person. But it never stops with those just near death. Have you noticed this? Maybe the critic listening to this is saying, well, Seth, that just applies to someone who's brain dead or in a coma that is not reversible. And so we pull the plug because they're not a person. You know, but no, it never works that way. It never stops with those just near death. As my friend John Stonestreet at the Chuck Colson Center for Worldview points out, he says, like the German extermination initiatives, these laws expand every time they are tried. The debate begins with those near death, but it quickly expands to those who are terminal, then to those with incurable diseases, then to those with permanent conditions, then to the disabled, and finally to the depressed and mentally ill. First, consent is required. Then it is implied. Finally, it is unnecessary. Now, if you think I'm a conspiracy theorist, how about this? A 29-year-old in the Netherlands is scheduled to die this month. May of the year of our Lord 2024, a 29-year-old in the Netherlands is scheduled to die due to crippling depression. And according to John Stonestreet's order there, by the way, once you're finally justifying the euthanasia of the depressed and mentally ill, soon consent won't even be necessary to kill those that the state think are a burden. The Netherlands became the first country in the world to legalize euthanasia in 2002. It was stated to be intended only for, quote, a small group of terminally ill children who suffer hopelessly and unbearably, whose palliative care options are not sufficient to relieve their suffering, and who are expected to die in the foreseeable future, end quote. And in 2019, okay, fast forward from 2002, when the Netherlands legalized euthanasia, to 2019, there was a story of a 17-year-old girl in the Netherlands named Noah, without an H, who chose to kill herself while her parents and doctors, quote, assisted her by doing nothing. And the reporters who covered this story said that she died through assisted suicide due to Netherlands law. But then people came out and said that no, it wasn't because of the law. It wasn't because anyone helped her. She didn't have a doctor help her. And in 2017, this young woman had contacted an end-of-life clinic who said that Noah did not die of euthanasia. To stop her suffering, she stopped eating and drinking. And so critics of conservatives came out and said, no, this 17-year-old was not killed with assistance as part of assisted suicide. She just stopped eating and killed herself. And so conservatives were saying, this is literally a result of your own legislation and laws. And radical leftist journalists were saying, no one assisted her in killing her. And after repeated hospital stays, she was placed in a coma to allow her to be fed. Noah then decided she wanted no further treatment. A hospital bed was set up for her in her parents' home, and she refused all food and fluids. Her parents and doctors reportedly agreed not to force feed her. And Dutch medical guidelines stipulate that if a patient withholds their consent to what? To be fed. If a patient withholds their consent, quote, care providers may not provide treatment, nursing, or care. Translation, Dutch law did allow a teenager to kill herself with the assistance of adults. Now, did they give her a lethal injection? No. They stood by and did nothing and let a 17-year-old kill herself while they watched, while they observed, while they looked on as observers and did nothing. Is that assisted suicide? You bet that's assisted suicide. And it's a result of their own law passed in 2002 to legalize euthanasia. Abortion and assisted suicide are part of the same worldview. The majority of people choosing assisted suicide do so because they say they, quote, fear losing autonomy or being less able to engage in activities. In other words, when we lose autonomy and control, our lives lose their value. Those seeking doctor-assisted suicide do so for the same reasons the pro-abortion advocate uses to justify killing the unborn. When a society accepts the killing of the unborn for reasons related to the child's inability to survive on their own, it's only a matter of time until we accept that view post-birth. Here's how it works. Kill the baby because they will be too expensive to raise. Kill granny because she will be too expensive to care for. When human value is dependent on utility, then there is no one we can't kill. And since 2016, several U.S. states have made moves to legalize the practice of physician-assisted suicide. To date, 9 states and the District of Columbia have legalized assisted suicide. California, Oregon, Washington, Vermont, New Mexico, Colorado, New Jersey, Maine. In fact, in Oregon, there have been several stories and reports, listen to this, of cancer patients being pressured and pushed toward assisted suicide because it's cheaper. It's cheaper to kill you than all of those medical treatments. Cancer drugs range from $3,000 to $6,000 a month, but lethal injection is only $50. It's only $50 to kill you. It's a lot cheaper than $6,000 a month. As Nancy Pearcey says, it doesn't take a genius to see that the easiest way to reduce healthcare costs is physician-assisted suicide. When human life is no longer seen to have inherent value, it will be subject to purely utilitarian calculation of cost and benefits. Voluntary euthanasia may not remain voluntary. Mic drop. Let me say that again. That's the summary. That's the summary of today's show. Voluntary euthanasia may not remain voluntary long. Why? Because we don't even know what a person is anymore. Because Philip Dick, in his 1974 book, The Pre-Persons, was right. When Roe v. Wade ripped the term human from person apart, we were like ship lost at sea, tossed about by every wind and wave, unable to ground ourselves and our understanding of who we are. Therefore, the state and those with political power, functioning off of the debauched theories of philosophers high on their own intellectual flatulence, will determine the definition of person. And eventually, that definition and theory of personhood can just be malleable and redefined and reshaped to fit the preferences of the majority and the preferences of those with political power. And if you sucking on the scientific and government teat is too expensive because you're going to die soon anyways, you're terminal anyways, well, maybe voluntary euthanasia won't remain so voluntary. Maybe when human life is no longer seen to have intrinsic dignity because you're image bearers of God, maybe the eugenicists and Darwinists of the 21st century will just kill you if you're too expensive to take care of. Oh, and by the way, if you become kind of a pain for the liberal establishment because you're questioning their dogmas and policies, maybe we'll just get rid of those politically troublesome to the regime as well. This is the Darwinian path to death. Remember the title of Darwin's book, by the way. What was the title of Darwin's book? On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Ah, the preservation of favored races. Some people are more favored. Well, if we come from animals and the essential struggle is the survival of the fittest in the struggle for life, then eventually we will live like animals. The strong will survive and the weak will die, even if the strong have to kill the weak in order to survive. The favored races will simply become the strong and those with power. Mildred Jefferson, the first black woman to graduate from Harvard Medical School and the co-founder of the National Right to Life Committee, said, "Today it is the unborn child. Tomorrow it is likely to be the elderly or those who are incurably ill. Who knows, but that a little later, it may be anyone who has political and moral views that do not fit into the new distorted order." By the way, you think that's a conspiracy theory? How about this? In 2016, an international group of bioethicists published a statement calling on state governments and authorities to get involved in making hiring decisions in healthcare. Why? Because of Christians and those common sense healthcare workers who objected to the culture of death. They urged governors to set up tribunals to coerce doctors and healthcare workers into performing abortions, infanticide, and euthanasia. That International Tribunal of Bioethicists and Eugenicists put those things together to set up tribunals to coerce doctors and healthcare workers into performing abortions, infanticide, and euthanasia, even if they believed those practices were morally wrong. If the pro-life doctors continued to protest, this statement suggested that they should be punished by being required to perform community service or attend re-education sessions. In other words, they should be thrown in gulags for being a threat to the regime by not enforcing the philosophies and assumed beliefs of the architects of the culture of death. Who will stand in the way of this progressive revolution? No dissent is allowed in the culture of death. It might sound like a conspiracy theory to say that the euthanasia vans will come for you one day too. But let's look at what happens to people who refuse to bow the knee to the eugenics, materialistic, and Darwinistic orthodoxy. Remember, what bioethicists debate eventually becomes law enforced through the courts. And this is happening in countries that have legalized assisted suicide. This is happening now. In Holland, in 2015, a doctor was sued for refusing to sign off on a request by a patient for the drugs to kill himself. In Belgium, in 2016, a Catholic nursing home was sued for refusing to allow a doctor to give a woman a lethal injection on church-run premises. And in America, during the Trump administration, in Vermont, a nurse was threatened with career termination if she did not assist with an abortion. She was threatened to be fired if she didn't assist with killing a baby at a hospital in America. And in the first 100 days of the Biden administration, the Biden's Health and Human Services Department dropped the lawsuit filed against the Vermont hospital during the Trump administration, thus communicating you can be threatened with losing your career if you don't participate in the taking of innocent human life. In other words, kill this baby or else you lose your job. It's almost like no dissent is allowed in the culture of death. It's almost like that same dehumanizing logic that animates abortion and that animates euthanasia and doctor-assisted suicide, it's almost like that same dehumanizing logic will come for you too one day. If you are, to quote Mildred Jefferson, those with political or moral views that do not fit into the new distorted order. Do not be part of that distorted order. Dissent to the culture of death. Resist that culture of death. The euthanasia vans are coming, folks. In fact, they're already in Europe. They may come here someday soon too, because we allowed bad ideas to fester, to be taught at our universities, and to become reflected in legislation as enforced by the courts. If you don't uproot that culture of death, root and branch, it will continue to birth nasty, rotten fruit that will destroy freedom, life, and liberty as we know it in America. Those who murder the unborn cannot be trusted to govern the born. And those who murder the unborn and born will one day murder you too. The longer you refuse to engage against a culture of death that has been building for many, many decades in America. Do not let the euthanasia vans come. Let's prove Philip Dick's book, The Pre-Persons, wrong by rebuilding a culture of life in America before it's too late. Thank you guys for joining the show today. Head on over to iTunes, Spotify, YouTube. Give the show a rating and review. Go to Rumble and subscribe for when YouTube inevitably, eventually, digitally assassinates me. To join the White Rose Resistance, go to thewhiterose.life. Sign up at $35 a month, will you? We need your help. We're the fastest growing pro-life organization in America. We're trying to wake up the church all around the country, launch resistance chapters all around the country. We can't do this without your help, but you're the resistance. So when you join our digital community with courses, a pro-life masterclass, curriculum, live calls with me, and at $70 a month, we equip you with a book club. It's called Books in the Barracks. We're reading a book about Kinsey right now. We hang out and talk. We talk about it. Sometimes we get the author on the call. We need your help. And if you want to host, listen to me, if you and your church want to host a screening of my film, The 1916 Project, this summer, this is the only way you can watch this movie, featuring Jack Hibbs, John Amanchukwu, Eric Metaxas, Nancy Pearcey, Bill Federer, Dr. George Grant. The only way is to go to the1916project.com, click the button to host a premiere. And you can't watch this film until September when it streams online. But you can request a screening now by going to the1916project.com to show it at your church, to get the message of Christian resistance out there and to teach Americans and the believers how this culture was created so we can flip it upside down, reverse engineer this bad boy, and rebuild a culture of life. Go to thewhiterose.life to join the White Rose Resistance. Until next week, I'm Seth Gruber, and this is The Seth Gruber Show.